morning. Welcome back to Christian Companions. As I always say, if you stumbled upon this video, this is a 55 and older Sunday school that we normally have on Sundays at 10:30. But during the pandemic, we were just going to do videos. So if you are here and you're confused, we have a book. And if you'd like to participate, contact the church and get a book. As for my regular group, hello, welcome back. This is the last day in the books that you have right now. It is August 30th. It's the very last one in the back of the book, lesson 13. I want to start with an announcement before I forget. If you have not received your book by this next Sunday, so the first Sunday in September, if you haven't received your new book, contact me and let me know, because I'm sending them out this week. They should be getting there, if not this week, then next week. And so it's I want to make sure you get those. And if you don't, just contact me and you can go back and watch the video. So last one means we're wrapping up James. We're going to start in James 3, and then he's going to jump to James 5, skipping all of James 4. But who really needs James 4 anyway? It's just, a warning against being in the world. Who needs it? But we're going to be in James 3, 13 through 18, and 5, 7 through 12. And I'll just go ahead and read. This is what the NIV says. Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. Then we move on to James 5. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no. Otherwise, you will be condemned. All right, so I will go to the ESV maybe once or twice. I'm trying to remember where I appreciate the wording. I can't. I'll figure it out when we get there. But we'll just keep plowing along, and we'll hit the introduction. It has been said that all of life is suffering. This idea is not all that shocking, of course. It has been articulated in many contexts around the world. As Christians, we understand that the suffering we experience is a result of sin in general. Some try to downplay the reality of suffering, but suffering, especially in the form of persecution, is part of the Christian life. In James's day, the limited scope of Christianity shaped the types of persecution. Today, when Christianity is a global faith, persecution differs from culture to culture. In certain African nations, Muslim populations have severely persecuted Christian neighbors. In other locations, official government policy hinders Christian meetings and the formation of churches. In the West, the matter is not quite so clear-cut. What constitutes persecution? While we are not being thrown to the lions in the Roman Colosseum or burned at the stake, subtle forms of persecution do indeed exist. These include social ostracism, which is part of the life experience of many Christians. How should we handle this kind of persecution when we encounter it? This is it's hard for me to, I understand where he's coming from. This absolutely happens. I've personally never experienced it. I've grown up in the church. I grew up in a small town. I went to Bible college, so I was pretty accepted there for my faith. And then when I came here, I pretty well was accepted because I grew up. I went to church. I associated with church people. Very rarely has someone said, "You are dumb for believing this." I'm sure people experience that. I personally haven't. And I will say that religious persecution happens in a lot of places to a lot of people. There's this great book. I bring that up because there's this great book called Lessons from the East, and it's written by this pastor who started a multi-faith organization where he said if we look at our own martyrs and our own persecution and ignore the rest, then we are going to eventually be persecuted and martyred by the same entities that are persecuting, martyring people today. And so I have the very, I don't know a very soft spot in my heart for people of all faiths, because one, I think when somebody belongs to another faith, we tend to forget about them evangelistically. Like we think, well, he's a Muslim, or, oh, he's Jewish, or, oh, well, they go to the Buddhist temple. And we don't think, well, yeah, but they still need Jesus. We just say, yeah, they belong to that. It's like, no, we need to love them just as much as sinners and the lost, and find them and bring them in. But again, also, like he said, if we ignore other religious persecution, someday they might ignore our own, which I have a soft spot for. So, but again, that doesn't downplay our own persecution that we might face in this world now. Anyhow, lesson context. At the beginning of our studies in James, we noted a few themes that run throughout the letter. These themes unite, I almost said untie, these themes unite the disparate topics that James addresses. Wisdom is one such theme. Recall, for example, that at the outset of his letter, James encouraged his readers to have perseverance in the midst of temptations or trials, and this they could do by actively seeking God's wisdom. In today's text, James addresses two very different situations, both of which demand wisdom on the part of believers. So, we'll just keep plowing along. So James 3, 1 through 12, last week's lesson introduced an address to teachers and potential teachers among first century churches specifically. Even so, we proposed extended application to all Christians. We wonder, however, if the remainder of James 3 is also addressed specifically to teachers and potential teachers, since James does not use the words teachers in these 6 verses. Ultimately, though, such a question is only hypothetical. It's impossible to imagine these verses applying only to teachers and not to anyone else. Agreed. Yeah, I think he's saying here, it's hard to take this out of context, right? To say this is separate from what he's been talking about. He says, not a lot of you should be teachers. And then in chapter 3, verse 1, and then he skips down to 3:13 and says, well, so who is wise and understanding? And in between that is taming the tongue. And so I think that is, as an argument, a flow of topic is naturally understood. It's pretty easy. Not many of you should be teachers because it's so hard to tame the tongue. And so therefore, who is wise and understanding, live a good life and have a tame tongue and be wise and all that. So I think it's a natural flow. And so I think it's kind of addressing teachers, and then the realization that we all have the potential to be teachers, and we all should be teaching in some form or fashion. So therefore, tame your tongue, and therefore, who is wise and understanding, so on and so on. Anyhow, verse 13, who is wise and understanding? Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom. So the commentary says, by speaking of the one who is wise and understanding, James likely continues to have the teachers in mind. Again, he kind of contradicts himself there. I think this is a generality. He introduces the issue in a confrontational way. So you think you're wise and understanding. Kind of. He seems to ask, then prove it by living a good life. The word in the original language refers to one's entire way of life or lifestyle. This word occurs in a dozen other New Testament passages. The teacher's pattern of life must manifest good deeds. A teacher must put into practice personally what is taught. We see the idea of matching talk with way of life repeatedly in the New Testament. The truth of Christian teaching is verified by the way of life of those who teach it. The Apostle Peter seems equally concerned with the relationship between good deeds and one's lifestyle. A teacher's understanding or claims of having understanding must be backed up with evidence. There is a word for those who say one thing but do another. That word is hypocrite. The word translated humility carries much overlap in meaning with the word gentleness. Paul connects the two Greek words that way in 2 Corinthians 10:1 and Titus 3:2. Yeah, so I think this is a really important verse. Who is wise and understanding among you? I don't recall. He's kind of implying that this is a negative question of, so you think you're wise and understanding, well, then live a good life. I think it's more of like, let he who is wise and understanding show it through his good life. It's not so much it's not accusatory or derogatory. It's, if you are wise and if you think you are wise and understanding, well, then live a good life. Like, show it through humility, show it through deeds done in humility, which comes from wisdom. Right? I don't think it has to be like, oh, you think you're so wise, well, then live a good life. That's crazy. And just this idea, if you are wise and understanding, it flows so naturally. If you are wise and understanding, you will live a good life. And if you live a good life, that's because of deeds done in humility, because of your wisdom. There's a reason why people are called smarty pants when they're being showing off their brain. It's like, ooh, smarty pants over here. Nobody's ever called wisey pants. You know what I mean? Nobody's ever made fun of for wisdom. It's always like, oh, Mr. High and Mighty with his education. It's never, oh, Mr. High and Mighty with his experience and spiritual understanding and philosophical insight and wisdom. Nobody ever does that. And so that's because wisdom produces humility, I think. If you are wise, you are humble in your wisdom, and therefore your deeds, people who are just educated can tend to be haughty and, what's the word? Just build themselves up. Here it's like, no, the wise don't do that. The wise are humble. And again, I don't think it's accusatory. I think that's crazy. Verse 14. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. So envy translates a word that can also be rendered zeal, as it is in John 2:17. That's zeal in a good sense. The lesson verse before us, portrays zeal in a bad sense, as an attitude that crosses over into inappropriate jealousy. That such envy is bitter, That such envy is bitter suggests that it manifests itself in anger and harsh speaking. It is conceivable in this context that teachers might harbor envy of each other's gifts. This would result in strife, as it had in Corinth. If in 1 Corinthians 1, 10 through 13, and 11, 18. If this is the case, there is no reason for any of James's readers to boast about their understanding or their so-called wisdom. Such behavior will seem from the outside to prove that their teaching is a lie. Thus, it brings disrepute to the truth of the gospel they proclaim. I like the word disrepute. That's why I paused. Sorry. So this kind of goes about what I just said, right? If you're wise, you won't boast about your wisdom, because wisdom breeds humility. Intelligence, while good, can often breed, again, I'm going to use the word haughtiness. I can't think of a word that's like beyond confidence. Like, you're not confident, you're, I guess, cocky, but I don't like that word. I think it's overused. So I'll say haughtiness. Intelligence can breed haughtiness easily, while wisdom can often breed humility. And so he says that here, because I don't think anyone who is wise will harbor bitter envy or selfish ambition. However, I'm gonna get real technical with you, because there's a couple Greek words in today's texts, 3:14 specifically and 3:17, that I really like. So the word bitter envy is this. That's Zalon, translated envy here. And as a commentary suggests, it's the word for zeal. I mean, it's Zalon. Zalon, zeal, Zelon. Here, Zalon. So yeah, it's the word for zeal or zealous. And the word Zalon has two connotations, right? Zeal, and he says that here. It can be positive, as in zeal. Jesus has a zeal for his Father's house. That's a good thing. He's zealous. He wants to do well by his Father's church, or by his Father's house. But it can also have this negative idea of envy or jealousy. I think that's why James puts the word bitter in front of it. I think the word bitter isn't a qualifier to be parsed. Like, it's not, the word bitter is just there, I think, as a qualifier of this is bad zeal. so that the audience, including us, can understand that it's not, zeal isn't bad, it's bitter zeal. It's bad zeal that is bad. So he doesn't miss. So bitter envy can be like thought of as passion. I wrote it down. Passion for one's own interests in the face of what appears to be competitive. So jealousy or envy. Passion for one's own interests in the face of what appears to be competitive. So you're up against somebody, you see somebody else, and you want your own self to be lifted up above them. Jealousy or envy. And then the word selfish ambition, which is actually one word. I know it. Okay, I know you probably don't really care what the Greek says. I'll write it in English though, just so you know. Say one, and oof, not gonna have enough room. Air, e. Oh boy. Okay. Just so you know, I mean, I know in general, you as a class probably don't care about the Greek as much or how to pronounce it correctly. However, I think it's interesting. So Zalon is where we get zeal. And then this is erytheon. It's not they, it's they. So erytheon, which is one word for selfish ambition, can literally be translated interest in gaining advantage over someone. And it comes from the Greek word erytho, which means to provoke, which is interesting, I think. But notice that bitter envy and selfish zeal, or bitter envy and selfish ambition, in the kind of traditional denotation, the traditional definition, it puts yourself above the other. The bitter Zalon is passion for one's own interests in the face of someone else's. And selfish ambition, erytheon, is interest in getting advantage over another. So he's saying the same thing here. He's saying, but if you harbor your own self-interests, your own desires, your own will over someone in your hearts, that's not worth being proud of. You shouldn't boast about your ambition to beat others. Because effectively, I think that he's saying here is that in itself is denying the truth. Do not boast about it and therefore deny the truth or deny the truth. Anyhow, so we'll keep moving. And sorry if you're like, boy, this guy in the Greek, get over it. I will after verse 17, I promise. So, verse 15, such wisdom does not come from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. James has articulated the standard. Lives must match words. But the reality is that at least some among James's readership do not meet this standard. They adhere to their own wisdom, a wisdom that does not come down from heaven, meaning that it is not from God. All one has to do is consider its fruits in 3:14 to see this. We might say that earthly wisdom is worldly. The idea is the same. It does not originate from God. Unspiritual is the very opposite of spiritual, devoid of the Spirit of God. The condemnation of demonic reinforces the identity of its source. Yeah, so the quotes around wisdom aren't in the Greek, but you can read into that because calling this wisdom isn't really wisdom. And calling it earthly, unspiritual, and demonic, a lot of the time when you see lists of 3 in the Bible, the third one is really important. I'm not going to make a case here for that because I haven't studied this verse in that manner. But think about faith, hope, and love. Which one's the greatest of these? Love. Faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. The third one is the most important. So you could make an argument that he's really making a point here that if you have wisdom that is about yourself or wisdom that is about gaining advantage over another, this is predominantly, most importantly, against and anti-Christ, right? I say anti-Christ in the traditional Greek sense. We could get into a whole discussion about what that means because I don't think there is one anti-Christ. I think it's anti-Christs. It's a whole thing. Don't worry about it. If you're like, this guy's crazy, you can email me or call me. It's fine. We talked about it in my Revelation class. I'm going to keep going. But basically what I'm saying here is wisdom that is not from God, therefore is anti-God, right? Like there's no earthly wisdom can have a lot of gray areas, but this one doesn't. There's either wisdom from God and wisdom not from God. There's no gray area here for him when it comes to selfish ambition and bitter envy. There you go. Verse 16, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. All of this should be no surprise. Worldly wisdom leads to bad outcomes. In this case, it leads to disorder and every evil practice. The communal impact of this wisdom is damaging in the extreme. It threatens the very integrity of the churches. Yeah. There's a lot to be said considering what is happening in the world right now about this verse. You can make an argument from either side politically, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to breeze past it. I'm going to ignore it because we can't have a conversation about it, and so I would just be whichever thing I say, it's going to sound like I'm trying to indoctrinate you. But I will say it's important to have a filter primarily of a theology. It's so important. You need to see the world through the lens of the Bible, of Christ, of your theological thought. Of theology is the study of God, which the traditional, that's a hard definition, but basically everything in my life is ordered out of my theology. I don't have a political philosophy, social philosophy, how I run my household, how I do my job, how I drive my car. Everything is filtered out of my theology. What does God say about X, Y, and Z? And so, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder in every evil practice. That's because this envy and selfish ambition, look to 15, is earthly. It's unspiritual. It's demonic. It's outside of Christ. And so to have anything filtered through a lens that's not theology and Christ and the Bible is to have a lens that's earthly and unspiritual and demonic. So that's where everything ought to flow. Verse 17. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial, and sincere. What a list. There is a better choice. This is what the commentary says. The adjectives that James applies to the wisdom that comes from heaven, from God, call to mind Paul's list of the fruit of the Spirit. Most of these terms are clear because they are used in the manner that is consistent with the other writers of the New Testament. Submissive means something like willing to yield or open to reason. To be impartial goes hand in hand with having sincerity. That's fair, but those are the two words I want to kind of talk about from the Greek. But yeah, what a list. I mean, wisdom that comes from heaven is pure. It seems to be a flow. First of all, it's pure. Then it's peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy, good fruit, impartial, and sincere, which we'll get into in 2 seconds. I'm going to erase this. If you want to get those words, you can rewind. But something inside of me tells me you don't want those words. So I'm going to take my little piece of paper here with me. This is impartial. Oh boy. Bear with me. Diakritos, and then this is sincere. Again, I'm sorry if you're like, this is the boring part, we don't need to watch this, but I appreciate it, and hopefully you will too. Almost done. It's hard to go back and forth between Greek and English. I forget which is which. So, diakritos and anapokritos. I spelled that bad. Anapokritos. Anapokritos. Whatever. Basically, it's that. So here's what that means. So I think this is important. Adiakritos is better translated as persuadable or ready to listen. That is so much more important than impartial. Impartial means I am going to hear you out as a third person, but persuadable means not only am I willing to listen, but I'm willing to change my mind about something if you present it with a cruciformed, a cross-led lens, right? I am not only ready to listen and be impartial to what you're saying, but I am willing to change my mind about what you have to say, right? You might hear somebody have a political thought, and you think, well, that's stupid. Well, you need to be of this heavenly wisdom, I'll hear it out and be impartial. I'll be persuadable, but that doesn't mean accepting of everything, right? That's totally different. Being impartial means that you'll hear it out, but it doesn't mean you'll accept it or change your mind or anything. It just means that you'll hear two sides and say, well, I'm in the middle, or I'm a third party that'll hear it out. But to say I am persuadable or I'm ready to listen means not only am I hearing you, but I might even change my mind and be willing to do so, which I don't think happens either in the church or in the world in general. I think we, as a society, have it hits me in the heart because I am very philosophically minded. I think we ought to ask why to everything that we do and say, and that's through the lens of theology again. And so I'm not saying that I'm full of godly wisdom. Don't hear that, but I love that interpretation. And then anapokritos means without pretense, unfeigned, genuine, and sincere. And they kind of say that. Oh no, he doesn't really say. He talks about submissive, but we kind of understand what submissive means. But open to submissive and sincere or submissive and impartial kind of go hand in hand. Anyhow, but sincere means you're genuine, right? You're without pretense. You aren't putting on a show. You aren't going into church. Oh, I was gonna make a good joke. It's not a joke. I was gonna say you go into church without wearing a mask. But I mean like an emotional, spiritual mask. You're walking into church and you're not going like, oh yeah, everything's great. I'm praying all the time. I'm reading my Bible. Me and Jesus are great. When your world you might be going to church like, I'm not good. Like I'm terrible at this. Or I'm having a bad day. I try to do that, but if you go through a bad spell of a couple weeks, then people are like, this guy's never good. This guy's always negative. But it's being genuine without being, you can be genuine and not be disparaging. Anyway, but this is the fun part. This word is literally translated without pretending to be an actor or without pretending like an actor. So basically not putting on a show, literally not putting on a show, literally not acting like an actor would. Isn't that interesting? I think that's fascinating. So I think worst case scenario, I think if you were like, I hate the Greek, I'm tired of it, at least I got you back on that one, I think, personally, because that's interesting. This means, literally, the be sincere means don't be an actor, be yourself. Interesting. That's all the Greek, I promise. Verse 18. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. So the desired goal of one who seeks true wisdom is peace. Heretofore, the teachers may have been fostering, or at least haven't tried to stop, conflicts among themselves. Those who are peacemakers, however, are said to sow in peace. A harvest of righteousness can be both what is sown and what is harvested as a cycle of peace begins. Righteousness is inclusive of one's words and one's works. Yeah, and again, I don't know why he keeps going back to this teacher idea when at the start he said this isn't necessarily about teachers, it's a generality. He seems to be hitting the teachers pretty hard. I think this is in general. But, and again, 18 goes hand in hand. It's like you have two sides of this coin. You have wisdom from the world and you have wisdom from God, which are diametrically opposed, excuse me. And so he finishes by saying, so be a peacemaker and sow in peace so that you may reap a harvest of righteousness. So again, and that goes hand in hand with like, hear everybody out, but have that lens of theology so that you can have wisdom from heaven and therefore sow peace and righteousness in your community. It goes hand in hand. So, I mean, how important for right now, right? There's two sides. There's multiple sides. There's all these different opinions and shouts and yells. And he's saying, find wisdom from God so that you can be pure and peace-loving and considerate and submissive, full of mercy, good fruit. You hear everyone out and you're sincere in what you do. You don't put on a show for this when you do this. And then be a peacemaker through that. Through that lens, sow peace so that the whole community and yourself can harvest righteousness. Wow, that's so important right now, isn't it? Oh, man. It's almost like the Holy Spirit knew what was happening. Let's keep moving. Now we're on to James 7 through 12, and there's a little introduction. In order best to understand James's directives in 5, 7 through 12 next, we have to understand that these are in response to the first 6 verses of the chapter. A strong argument can be made that 5, 1 through 6 is spoken against landlords who are unbelievers. We notice that they are not called to repent, but to weep and wail in light of the coming judgment. Such landowners come from the handful of rich outsiders who make life miserable for any of their tenant farmers and or day laborers. It is unlikely that such landlords even hear or read these words themselves. Instead, the accusations are written for the benefit of impoverished Christians of Jewish background to whom the letter as a whole is addressed. Yeah, I mean, this is 5, 1 through 6 is basically you will face persecution and trials of many kinds, even from those you work for, your landlords, but fear not, because everybody will find justice by the end of it. So, verse 7 then. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmers wait for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. So James is writing to a group of believers who have cause to be angry and despondent. The phrase brothers and sisters indicates that James's words are not intended for the rich landlord unbelievers in James 5, 1 through 6, but for Christians who suffer at their hands. James points the opposed believers to the Lord's coming as the ultimate solution. This might seem like a cop-out to some modern readers who are used to enacting change through the democratic process. But we have to, again, how apropos. But we have to remember that the world of the first century AD has no such process. Appeal for change might be made to the consciousness of those who have the power to make a change, which is why Paul was arrested and he wanted to go to Rome. He wanted to make a change for the Christian church by effectively baptizing Caesar, but still. But hope for change ultimately resides in taking the long view, which looks to the return of Christ. The patience this requires is illustrated by an analogy of a farmer. To await Jesus' return requires patiently waiting on the part of believers. Just as the farmer waits patiently for his crop, the poor, oppressed believers are to wait patiently for the coming of God's judgment. Because God can be trusted to send a harvest in its time, Jesus can also be trusted to return as he has promised. The seasons of rain mentioned may not be similar to our experience. In Israel, it is quite rare for rain to fall between May 1st and October 15th. Thus, the autumn and spring rains refers to the rain that comes during the rest of the year. Since James's addressees are scattered among the nations, their experience will differ by location, but they probably know of the crop and weather cycles of the land of Israel, at least from the scripture tells them about it. Yeah, so, I mean, it also just... it rains more in autumn and spring in that time also. In that area, it doesn't matter. April showers, right? Bring May flowers. It rains in spring. Doesn't matter. And we have been in a drought and they live in the desert. It's a whole thing. Don't worry about it. I think that just the rains part is overstated. That's all I'm saying. But yeah, he's talking to these people that, this whole book is about... how to be better in the face of persecution and ask for wisdom and all sorts of these kinds of things. So, and he's about to end his letter to the diaspora, and so he's kind of starting his conclusion here. Be patient. Be patient until Jesus takes you. Be patient until Jesus takes you. See how just like the farmers. That's what he's getting at. In verse 8, which is a little problematic. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Just like the former verse 7, James's audience is to be patient. This no less applies to us today. The counsel to stand firm or be strengthened speaks to one's inner resolve. Christians must be resolute and courageous in earthly circumstances while awaiting the Lord's coming. Such resolve will involve rejecting the negative views of skeptics. So here's the thing. The Lord's coming is near, said some thousands of years ago, a couple thousand years ago. But this is... basically, the early church thought Jesus was coming back pretty quick. But also, I think when it says the Lord's coming is near, I think if you look in the grand scheme of human history, it's still pretty near. You know what I mean? And it's nearer every day. Maybe that's what he was getting at. Anyhow, don't get hung up on that. I was just getting hung up on it like I'm doing is basically what I'm trying to say. So 9a, let's just do 9a and b. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. So 9a, why would James's addressees be holding grudges against one another? Based on what James has said about their oppressors, we could certainly understand how many in James's audience might be tempted to hold grudges against those who have mistreated them. But that is not what James deals with in this verse. One possibility is that those to whom James writes are taking out their frustrations with their rich oppressors on each another. Perhaps they disagree about how to handle the situation. Perhaps their oppressive situations are unequal, resulting in covetousness of fellow believers' assets or circumstances. Regardless, they're in danger of being judged unless they stop holding grudges. It would be tragic indeed if the judgment that God had prepared for their oppressors also comes on some of them because of failure in this regard. Actually, I am going to pause there, and then we'll do 9b. I don't think this charge is... I don't think James is specifically charging them because of a specific situation. That's what I'm trying to say. He's not saying this because he's heard of grumbling. I think he's saying this in general. In general, try not to grumble against one another. It seems like the commentary is making a point to say that James is pointing out one specific situation that he's heard of, but James is writing to a very general audience that's spread across a general land space. And so I think he's saying, again, in general, get along with one another. Like, be united in this. Don't grumble against one another. And he's saying because disunity in the church will lead to judgment. I think that's fair. Then 9b, the judge is standing at the door. So quickly, this warning implies the imminent return of the Lord. I think they could have stopped there. That he is standing at the door can mean expected very soon or can happen at any time. Either understanding is cause for repentance. Sin must be put aside immediately. When Christians harbor bitterness towards one another, they lose their witness. Yeah, to say the judge is standing at the door literally means God's going to come back and you don't know when he's going to come through the door. Easy. Verse 10. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Commentary, because of the strong opposition they faced, the prophets are examples to James's readers and to all future generations of believers of patience in the face of suffering. They endured so much. Suffering. They endured so much. Weird. Sorry, I just realized that that's not a comma. Man, they endured so much, period. As Hebrews 11:33, 37, 38 says, these were men who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in the desert and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. The prophets are thus examples to all Christians of all eras in their faith-based manner of life. They did not merely speak the words of God, rather they lived out their faith and trusted in him by action. But above all, the prophets were patient. The nation of Israel and Judah heard the words of the prophet and ignored them. We know that this was frustrating for the men who were called to prophetic ministry. It required a great deal of patience for them to keep preaching God's message of repentance to people who would not listen and would not obey, to their own destruction. Yeah, I think he's also mentioning the prophets here because he's, again, writing to a primarily Jewish-turned Christian audience. If you were born and raised in Judaism and then you became a Christian, you would know the Old Testament pretty well. And so he's saying, yeah, you remember all the stories you heard growing up, all those prophets. Well, and remember all their stories of suffering and pain and waiting. Be like them. Be patient in your suffering, just like the prophets that you've heard about. I think he's pointing that out for multiple reasons, but that's definitely one of them. So let's keep moving. 11a and B. I don't like it when they split these up. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen that the Lord finally brought about what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. So verse 11, this phrase speaks of the prophets as those who have persevered. The language is reminiscent of the blessing found in the Sermon on the Mount at Matthew 5:11 and 12. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Yep. And then verse 11b, this leads James to another example of perseverance and patience, that of Job. What the Lord finally brought about refers to the Lord's purpose in allowing Job to suffer as he did. Consider the outcome of Job's suffering. Those outcomes cause us to see the grace of the Lord, that he is full of mercy. Yeah, Job is a huge theological and philosophical book. It's super important to both Judaism and to Christianity. Well worth a read. It's very long, can be confusing, but is so worth it to go in and just highlight and circle and go through, especially in the midst of suffering or pain or torment or whatever you're going through. And it's a good example here of what James is talking about. James started with consider it joy when you're going through trials. Consider it joy when you're in pain and you're suffering and you're persecuted and all this stuff is happening around you. And he says, remember Job? Job lost his whole family. Job was in physical pain all the time. Job lost all of his wealth. Job had nothing left and he persevered. He continued in the Lord and the Lord brought him out of that, and because the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. So it's such an important book to show the God you serve will bring you out of this. And I think James kind of argues he has brought you out of this through the suffering of Jesus. So be patient in that because of God's mercy. Very important. I don't think he just grabbed Job out of nowhere and said, remember Job? No, he did that for a reason. So verse 12, the last verse, above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is simple yes or no, otherwise you will be condemned. Jesus appears by name only twice in this letter. Even so, James regularly alludes to his teachings, particularly as recorded in Matthew and Luke, frequently from the Sermon on the Mount. The verse before us offers the clearest connection in that regard, which features a direct quotation from Matthew 5:34 through 37. Elsewhere, the teachings of Jesus bubble just below the surface of James's discussion of wealth and poverty, suffering, wisdom, the control of the tongue, and much more. The verse at hand caps off this section of James's letter. The phrase above all implies that the swearing of oaths is the most egregious sin that the original readers are engaged in. Some commentators argue that oath swearing is the most serious because a broken oath directly involves God in a lie. We can envision situations in which poor Christians are tempted to swear oaths in order to obtain credit for food, all the while knowing they might not be able to pay the bill when it is due. In other words, the swearing of an oath involves them in behavior that does not glorify God. Quite the opposite. We note the negative outcome of oaths in Matthew 14, 6 through 12, 23, 16 through 22, and elsewhere. Yeah, I think this can also be simplified a little bit. I think it's the idea of swearing of oaths come in Matthew more than this. This seems more, I don't know, simplified. It's more the idea of just, I don't want to simplify it too much though. But it sounds like he's saying, don't take an oath, don't swear by anything, but just say yes or no. Like you don't have to go through the whole rigmarole of like guaranteeing or do all this stuff. Just be clear cut, yes or no. So that's it for James. That's it for this book. That's not it for James. James actually continues in 13 through 19. but our book doesn't cover that. Read it on your own time. Read all of James. It'd probably be worth it. It's a good book, especially right now. Everything in the world happening around us might be worth a read, or even Job, but that's more of an investment. I digress. I really enjoy this time teaching, even though I'm in an empty room. I hope you all are still. I've talked to most of you, I think, recently about it, and I think you've mostly enjoyed it. Anyhow, I miss you all. I can't wait till this room is full of people and that we can all laugh and just joke and drink coffee and have fun. But until then, I'll see you later.